you get cold?
See, I might have it.
You live? Yeah, you don't come to Canada.
Minus 30 degrees in the winter. 30 below. Come on, that's
There's nothing. You still next to your own, but she does come to Canada.
It is now resumed, and I recognize Senator Hayes, having indicated their willingness to speak next.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon, fellow senators. I would like to firstly welcome our new senators, Senator McConney and Senator Drakes, and Senator Adams, who's not here. And I would also like to lay a remembrance for our former president, Sir Fred Gollop. I got to know him on a personal level through my in-laws, so I knew him as a family man, and I never knew that he had such tremendous accolades until he passed. I would like to lend my support for the repeal of the NSRL. I would like to say that even though the NSRL was implemented in September 2016, the stage was set for its introduction from as early as 2013. We would all recall that the Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners, the Junior Doctors Association, the Barbados Association of Pharmacy Owners had long been raising alarms that they were concerned that there could be that healthcare provision could be put in jeopardy because of a disruption in the supply chain of pharmaceuticals, of surgical supplies, and numerous other necessities. The Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners at the time, through their then PRO, Dr. Linda Williams, and I quote, indicated that very basic supplies from sutures to blood tubes and gloves and very cheap medications, including things like Lasix, among others, medications for the elderly, medications for the pregnant, and for babies were not available because the hospital was not able to meet its financial obligations, and so its creditors had closed accounts. I was a member of staff at the QH at the time. I could not speak out on those things at the time, but I can tell you that there was no exaggerating. I remember a time we didn't have sterile gloves for surgery, we didn't have basic things like Panadol, we had a 2-day supply of anesthetic gas. So it was with this backdrop that the National Social Responsibility Levy was introduced to the public. We can all accept that healthcare financing is very, very burdensome for the government. The last available Chief Medical Officer report, which is for 2010 to 2012, indicates that 11% of government expenditure went towards funding healthcare. So we all accept that there is a need for sustainable healthcare financing. So when this was introduced, I personally, nobody likes a tax, but because of the stated intention of the tax, myself as a physician, I thought, okay, we could see how this goes. If it means that I get what I need to perform cataract surgery, if it means that my patients no longer have to buy drapes or buy lenses for surgery, if it means that some person who's having a pain doesn't have to bring their own Panadol to the hospital, I can get behind this new tax as it was presented to us. It was introduced in September 2016. At the time, my senator on this side had indicated, it was intended to raise over $80 million in revenue. At that time, it only generated about a quarter of the intended target. Unfortunately, it was no pain. It was a lot of pain and no gain for us because as a member of staff at the time, I can't recall seeing any objectifiable, any evidence of where this funding was ending up. Even with this, even with no evidence of where the money was going, even without the garbage trucks appearing, even with healthcare financing still in a disastrous state, 10 months later, we saw the levy raised from 2% to 10%. It was at this point that Barbadians who normally are pretty passive, who sat by quietly and bore the pain prior to that, I think that the raise in the tax was the breaking point. Because in July 2017, we saw over 20,000 people take to the streets of this city in what must have been the largest peaceful demonstration, I think, in our post-independence history. You had all races, all classes, you had trade unions uniting, you had private sector uniting people were just fed up. And even with the clear opposition to the tax as it was, the government still remained unmoved and decided to insist on maintaining the tax at this new level. At the time, I remember the Barbados Small Business Association, Dean Straker, reporting that the levy at its new rate was destabilizing several firms, and that just in order to keep doors open, they had no choice. They either had to retrench staff or look at transferring the added cost to consumers. And this was something that the opposition at the time, the now government, had indicated would have a negative impact on the economy. It would cause a dampening of consumer spending, it would have a negative impact on the economy, and it would also have an implication for locally produced products, because you would know not only was the NSRL applied to imports, it was also applied to domestically produced goods. So you would all recall Purity at one point was in the paper saying, well, yes, we had to raise prices, but it's not that Purity is raising prices. We have to pass on the cost as it pertains to the NSRL. We saw inflation rise from 1.5% to 4% in a year, and this inflation wasn't just general inflation, this was food inflation. So as Senator Greenwich had indicated, the cost of your basket of goods went up. You know, people just were trying to make ends meet. We saw an implication as well on our ability, on our competitiveness on an international level. You would recall that the World Bank Doing Business report recorded Barbados at 132nd globally. We had fallen from a ranking of 119th just 2 years prior. So the NSRL had ripple effects all through the economy, all through households. The money that was raised from it, even though the then Minister of Finance kind of bragged in the first quarter of the tax being levied at the 10% rate that they had garnered some $50 million in contributions from taxpayers. He counted his chickens before they hatched, because we all know that the tax actually generated less than half of its estimated target. So in closing, I would like to say that I oppose the tax not only on the grounds that it has made it difficult to live in Barbados, it raised the cost of living, but my objection actually is more focused on the fact that the tax as it was branded, the National Social Responsibility Levy, was actually, I believe, a deception in the way that it was branded. Because if it had performed the functions which it was stated to perform, I'm sure Barbadians would have happily dealt with it. If we could have gotten our garbage collection on time, if we could have had no fears having to go to the QEH, if our parents weren't going to have surgery and being sent back repeatedly. So with this, Mr. President, I submit my contribution in support of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Given the special circumstances, I think I am supposed to say something today regarding both bills. So my contribution regarding the NSRL is quite similar to, or she's alluded to it, Senator Haynes, as it regards to the bill. I know many of you have mentioned, many of the senators in the House have mentioned the national implications that the bill has had, and there are also international implications that were also seen as it regards to the implementation of the NSRL in Barbados. The government has clearly done its due diligence as it relates to stakeholder consultations, and the social partnership has clearly had a consensus that the NSRL is perceived as a revenue measure that has hindered economic activity in Barbados. There are some arguments to say that the levy has not been in place long enough to make, a good quantitative judgment of it, but we've had some reviews, particularly from Senator Holder, where she has eloquently expressed how economic activity has so far been impacted based on the NSRL. But what I'd like to also note, as Senator Haynes has said, is that the international competitiveness of Barbados was hindered by the tax. And the Doing Business report did say, the 2016 noted that paying taxes was actually made more difficult by introducing the NSRL. And at the time, the levy was only 2%. So therefore, an evaluation of the country, when it increased to 10%, would also then clearly see us having a greater negative impact to the country's competitiveness. Also, I'd like to note the World Bank report in 2018 that noted that we were 132nd out of 190 countries. Mr. President, I'd like that Barbados removes itself from looking at the ones that are beneath us, but looking towards the ones that are doing better than us and striving to become more competitive in the global market. So therefore, we can see from an international perspective that the NSRL does have a constraining effect on the economy as well as our competitiveness. And I think going forward, if we are open for business, that is something that we have to seriously look at when we implement national measures, and they have international implications. So therefore, Mr. President, my short contribution then on the NSRL is that I am in favor of it, with a footnote that I support Senator Nurse's contribution this morning that the savings that are perceived to be had with the removal of the tax are passed on to the consumers. And Senator Springer also noted this morning that we have to look at how a government is perceived by its people. And I would like to make a plea to the government to ensure that some mechanism is in place, that we have a publication of the retail prices of the basket of goods going forward, so that consumers actually have that information at hand on a consistent basis, so that we can actually go forward and say, well, the removal of the NSRL actually had the impact, particularly to consumers. And with that, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Mr. President, as I rise to wrap up debate on this bill, I want to thank all honourable members who have spoken on both sides, and certainly in expressing their support for the repeal of the NSRL. I've taken note of the comments of Senator Nurse, I believe, and Senator Moore in particular, in terms of the monitoring, and Senator Drake's, of the retail prices, and the need perhaps for us to do some PR in terms of the publication of the list so that consumers are aware of what is happening, and certainly government will be in a position to monitor the trends so that there be no price gouging as such. I've also noted the comment by Senator Moore that lambs and lions can walk together, and I certainly feel that this should be the way in which we, in this honourable chamber, certainly in Barbados, should continue as we try to get our country out of these difficult economic circumstances and work for the progress and development of this country that we so much love. Mr. President, with those few words, I want to move that this bill be now read a second time.
Motion is that this bill be now read a second time. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that you, Your Honor, do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
Move that I be now leave the chair, that the House resolve itself into committee. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. The ayes have it.
The lambs and lions. Lambs. Committee.
The House is now in committee.
Clause 1. Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 2. Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 3. Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 3 stand part.
The question is that clause 3 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 4. Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 4 stand part.
The question is that clause 4 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 5. Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 5 stand part.
The question is that clause 5 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do report to His Honour the Speaker the passing of one bill in committee. Senators against, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
His President.
Is
He's
it
the Speaker.
Is the Speaker? The question is that I do report to His Honour, the President, the passing of one bill in committee. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. It's the Speaker, man. It's the Speaker.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
Question is that this bill be now read a third time. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against? I record none. From the end of the business.
Mr. President, I now beg to move that this bill be now passed and cited as the Barbados Revenue Authority Amendment Act 2. So, be now, sorry, Mrs. The National Social Responsibility Levy Repeal Act 2008.
Question is that the bill be now passed and cited as, and be so cited. All those in favor? Aye. I record no dissentient voice.
Order number 1, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Barbados Revenue Authority Amendment Bill 2018.
So, President, I rise to speak briefly on this bill, which has been a source of much contention, especially among legal service areas in this country, and also in the matter of some businesses, those involved in real estate, and generally because it has caused a slowdown in business at a time when it was vitally important for the country that we should be promoting business and promoting activities that generate revenue. I believe it came out of a request from the Barbados Revenue Authority back in 2014, where they indicated that they were having challenges in seeking to implement part of the policy which was their mandate, that the payment of all taxes be administered by the authority prior to issuing a tax clearance certificate. And I want to make it quite clear at the outset that it is the policy of this government that people should and must pay the taxes in the country. This is absolutely necessary. We will note, however, that in terms of the recent budget, the Minister of Finance waived certain penalties and is given certain times in which persons can make themselves right, so to speak, with BRA in terms of being current with the taxes. But this matter was seen as one that was not serving the purpose. I think we could argue if we saw the principle in that BRA was trying to ensure that people pay their taxes and there was not this, in terms of the quantum of defaulting taxpayers and the revenue that should have been collected. But it is felt that the legislation at the time was rushed and perhaps there was not enough discussion. I believe that is a matter of perspective. Certainly the legal fraternity was, I wouldn't say up in arms, but was certainly very active about it. And they, in fact, wrote to the Attorney General at the time and indicated that they were planning to go to court over the entire matter. Whereas, on the other hand, BRA was saying that they had discussions with the SG's chambers and various other entities, and they thought that all of these matters had been ironed out. Mr. President, some of the issues raised by BAR through its attorneys were that they were concerned that the act as it was then was abrogating in several ways constitutional rights and protection of landowners, persons holding security interests over property, such as banks and cooperatives, and that it was seriously affecting the majority, if not all, of those persons involved in real estate activities. In addition, it questioned the whole issue of conveyance and how this was going to affect conveyances in Barbados. And I'm sure that other very learned members in this area, in this honorable chamber, will speak to this in much more detail than I could at this point in time. There were issues surrounding the tax clearance certificate, also obtained with persons trying to transfer interest in a property, seeking to transfer property by way of sale or gift, mortgage, or assent by a personal representative, that they were all being hindered by the requirement to have this tax clearance certificate. Indeed, I was explained to me that even in terms, perhaps in terms of divorce settlements, in terms of the separation of property, that these matters would have been held up and hamstrung by the need to have a tax clearance certificate. It got even ridiculous where, in terms of mortgages, where the mortgagee was required to provide tax clearance certificates for the person who was the purchaser at that point in time. And these things were thought to be really, according to the Bar Association, unacceptable. It even got more ridiculous in terms of the issuing of liquor licenses for persons who operated bars and rum shops, that they were required to show that they could obtain the tax clearance certificate in order to obtain their liquor license. So all in all, we thought then, as a party in opposition, that is the Barbados Labour Party, that this was a bad piece of legislation. I believe in both chambers, both houses, we argued against it. And it was one of the promises made also in terms of our policy going forward in our manifesto. And so today we have come with a bill to remove that burden, if you want to call it a burden, of the requirement for tax clearance certificate. And in terms of the amendments necessary, these are outlined, submitted in terms of section 2, that they be amended by leaving the definition, tax clearance, that the repeal of section 8A of the Act be deleted, and that certainly the enactment set out in the first column of the schedule, that these should be amended in the manner set out opposite thereto in the second column. And Mr. President, with those few words, a very straightforward matter, I believe, I beg that this bill be now read a second time.
Well, I put the motion, and
You want to speak?
anyone interested in speaking?
Mr. President, I rise on this occasion with some degree of pleasure, I have to admit. When this matter was first introduced in Barbados, I was in a different place, functioning in a different role, and at the time representing service providers, both large and small. Leader of Government Business has made reference to the response that came from the Bar Association, for example. But on that occasion, I represented cleaning associations, the Association of Rum Shop Owners. We represented the medical professionals, large, small, professional, non-professional, technical, non-technical, but all Barbadian workers in the services sector that drives this economy forward. At the time, Mr. President, these service providers were already dealing with increasing and constant levels of high taxation that had resulted in dampened consumer demand. They were themselves on the receiving end of non-payment of tax returns from a government that was owing them over extended periods of time, VAT returns, and in their personal capacity, income tax returns. And so they were struggling. The economy was in trouble. We were seeing all of our productive sectors that were the largest consumers of all of their services being dampened in terms of demand. And so they were in a very difficult place when these measures were introduced. And so it was our view that it was the role of government not just to practice responsibility, not just to ensure that they looked out for all their citizens, but to ensure that there was an enabling environment that allowed businesses at all levels to thrive. With the introduction of the tax clearance certificate measures, what we saw was the introduction of measures which, instead of enabling business to thrive, enabling informal service providers to enter the formal economy, we saw a retreat away from that. And we saw instead that we made it more difficult in this country, more burdensome, more bureaucratic, more challenging and more time-consuming to do business as a result of introducing a measure which, in principle, no right-thinking Barbadian would have opposed. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because as the leader of Government Business on our side has just rightfully said, we accept that the notion of government is that in order to do business and in order to provide the services that we as citizens desire or believe that we have an entitlement to, the government does no business, and so it depends on revenue from our taxes. And so we accept, and on the Barbados Labour Party side, we are supportive of any measure that seeks to legitimately collect that which is owed to government. But in so doing, Mr. President, that cannot be overly burdensome. That cannot have a counterintuitive effect. It cannot then dampen that thing which you are trying to stimulate, which in this case was business. Mr. Chairman, in that same year, there were several reports written about Barbados and the business environment in which we were operating. And there were a number of risks which were identified in the private sector report of 2015 by the Caribbean Development Bank. One of those risks was one of the things that we then cited in response to the introduction of this measure. It talked about weak public finances, and we accepted that. But it also talked about extensive institutional human capacity constraints to implement the measures. At the time, Mr. Speaker, the Barbados Coalition of Service Industries, which I then headed as the umbrella body for all service providers, spoke to government, as did other members in this Honourable House did, on the matter of the National Social Responsibility Levy. We sought to say to the government at the time, government is for the people and by the people, and that there must at all times be consultation with those persons who will be affected by the introduction of these measures. And so with all that I've said in mind, Mr. Speaker, dampened consumer demand, increasing taxes, contracting, every sector contracting, the business community had a legitimate need to have consultations with the government. And I was pleased at that time to lead a national consultation with those private sector members. And we had persons representing, and I have the report here, Mr. Chairman, and I'm willing to make it a document of the House because it subsequently was released in the press as a public document. We had persons representing the medical, legal, dental, building, construction, pharmaceutical, renewable energy, cleaners, health and wellness, you name it, Mr. Speaker, they were represented. And we prepared a complete document that spoke about the impact of these measures on the business community and our ability to do business legitimately, successfully, and efficiently in Barbados. Among the measures, we identified 3 main areas that were problematic. 1, the legal applicability of the measure. This was, of course, the main submission of the Barbados Bar Association. We spoke then also of the regulatory and administrative management challenges, which I made reference to in the CDB report, Mr. President. And then we talked ultimately about the overall impact on the business environment and the ease of doing business. There were a number of things which we found at the time. Those things held true throughout the implementation of this measure. It was an unfair indictment on thousands of legitimately functioning service providers who were paying the highest level of taxes already. In the state's attempt to collect taxes from the minority, you were casting a net so widely in a system that was already functioning so inefficiently that you were compromising the ability to implement. We said it was an unnecessary burden on the ability of service providers to conduct their lawful and legitimate business and practices as a result of debt payments. In many instances, they too were owed by the state, and that there was no mechanism, as has been seen in other countries. And if you were to look at the example of tax institutions in places like South Africa, Tanzania, who have all implemented tax certificate measure, tax compliance certificates, because it is a measure which is well used. The ability to get a tax compliance certificate is instantaneous. It is received online within minutes. The average wait time when this measure was introduced in Barbados was over several weeks. It took business in Barbados back by at least a decade, as did everything else that happened in the last 10 years. So, Mr. Chairman, it is a source of pleasure for me today, having prepared the report, having submitted the report, having called for consultation and received none, having asked for even an audience to discuss the challenges that our service providers were legitimately raised, and not even so much as receiving a response, Mr. President. We submitted then in formal fashion what our concerns were. There were threats of legal action. And as was said in this honorable chamber earlier today, there were a couple of different responses. Silence, more silence, even more silence. When silence was broken, we heard things like, they just don't want to pay them taxes. They're trying to escape the tax man. And we did not disagree that there were those that perhaps legitimately were trying to do just that. But to tie an entire system in the noose of bureaucracy for the purpose of being able to go after just a few when there were other mechanisms available to us to do just that was at best a nonsense, Mr. President. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this subject today because we said earlier, again, in someone else's contribution, this is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. And I'm rejoicing that in those instances where I, in my former life, was unable to get a response or unable to have any kind of reprieve on behalf of service providers at that time, that today I can stand in this place and lend my voice in full support of the repeal of this measure that speaks to tax clearance certificates as outlined in this repeal bill. And Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Good day, Senator Maxwell.
Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing me this opportunity to address the bill that is before the House at this time. But before I do, I wish, Mr. President, of course, it would be remiss of me, as this is my, what we call a maiden speech, to not take the opportunity, sir, to congratulate you on being unanimously elected as the President of this Senate, following in the footsteps of some other honorable senators, such as we would have mentioned Sir Gollop, who we would have laid to rest yesterday, and indeed, of course, I hope that we will be able to have an opportunity to have a moment of silence in respect to him. And also, of course, other honorable senators who would have held a position like Dr. Branford Tate, and of course, Sir Frank Walcott, and the last one would be Sister in Christ, Carrie Ann Eiffel. I would also wish to add at this time, of course, my joy to be here with you and fellow senators in sharing in this experience of representing our nation in such a place. And of course, I wish to, of course, thank Her Excellency Sir Dane Sandra Mason for affording me this opportunity to serve our nation. You know, I never thought that I would ever be in such a place, but God moves in mysterious ways, His wonders to perform. That being the case, Mr. President, I now add my voice to this debate on the bill before us, but let me preface my comments by congratulating the Prime Minister and the BLP for the overwhelming victory. And it so happened that that victory took place on my birthday, the 24th of May.
Birthday gift you get. That you didn't want. That you didn't want.
And, but I must hasten to add that even with that overwhelming victory, to whom much is given, much will also be required. And indeed, this new government comes in at a very critical stage in our nation where there are so many issues to be addressed that indeed I wish this government well as we seek to plod on in terms of restoring a good economy, and of course, not only economy, but of course a social state of well-being. Before us this afternoon, sir, there is the bill of dealing with the Barbados Revenue Authority Amendment Bill 2018. And before I say that and address it, I must again compliment the new government for, within a month's time, responding so aptly to a lot of the issues that are affecting our nation, because we are indeed traversing in some unprecedented waters, or as Michael Ipsonian, our PB, will say, the boat has been rocking for some time, and I hope that we'll be able to indeed stabilize our nation as soon as possible. However, as we have this bill before us, and I do support the measure of seeking to repeal certain areas of it, there are, however, some concerns that I do have of this bill, even as it is presented as one that will seek to stimulate business within our nation. And so, in as much as I am in agreement, Mr. President, for some of the amendments to the Act to facilitate business and to remove what I will consider that big stick policy of seeking to encourage persons or force persons or coerce persons to pay their taxes, there are a few concerns I wish to raise at this point. And the first is this, Mr. President. While I appreciate the efforts now being made by our new government in seeking to ease the situation for persons being able to attain or with no need to have a tax clearance certificate in order to move on with their lives, in order to move on with their businesses. And while I agree that with the repealing of Section 8A of Act 2014-1, that of outlining what will be defined as what I call again that big stick mentality or measure to encourage persons to pay the outstanding taxes. I do hope that in the repealing of that we don't open a can of worms, where Barbadians negatively take advantage of this system and the rate of tax defaulters may possibly increase. I'm not saying that Barbadians don't like paying taxes, but nevertheless, any loophole, I'm sure, will encourage persons to take that avenue. But this bill as it stands, while therefore the need to, indeed, I believe it needs to be balanced, of course, with the measures that will continue to encourage, inspire persons to indeed follow the regulations of our nation in terms of paying the taxes, because the government itself, of course, as we all know, rely on those taxes to improve our economy, improve our social services that are offered to all of us as Barbadians. As much as we will all wish, of course, to live without having to pay taxes, as much as we would have just voted to repeal the NSRL, we do know that the national and social development of our nation depends on the payment of taxes. And I would even go as far, of course, of making reference to the fact that our good Lord himself, even under an oppressive government, the Caesar government, would have encouraged even his fellow Jews to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Not saying, of course, that we have any oppressive government. But whether or not there was an oppressive government, he still encouraged the people to do their duty. And so even if we will say that we don't have an oppressive government today, then we should be even more encouraged then as citizens of our nation to ensure that we don't seek to tax evade, that we don't seek to be tax defaulters when we make this adjustment to this act. And so I will encourage, of course, our fellow Barbadians that even as we are here seeking to ensure that, for example, in getting one's land sold, that there wasn't all of this need to ensure to have a tax clearance certificate, that indeed they will use this opportunity still, however, to continue to be persons who are willing to pay their taxes. Because I would hate that, Mr. President, that come 2019, if there is an increase in defaults of those who got through with selling their land, that we would have to come here again and put in place the big stick policy to ensure that indeed we have some more compliance by the people of our nation. The second area of concern I have as well, Mr. President, is, and I speak from a layman's perspective, not like the learned lawyers among us and the accountants and the economists among us, but I do have a concern when I examine the bill as it stands, where we are making the amendments, yes, particularly to the Land Tax Act, where indeed it really emphasizes, in my understanding of it, that all that is required for someone to have the go-ahead to sell their land is that they have to be up to date, and I put it in layman's terms, they have to be up to date in paying their land tax. While when I go down then to the Liquor License Act, it is interesting to note that there are a lot of other requirements for one to have in place before one is granted a license to do business. And if we are saying that indeed we are seeking to encourage business, and I hope I'm being careful here, because I know as a Christian minister, you know, one will wonder, well, why is he seeking to make it easier to sell liquor? But indeed, I'm looking at the business aspect here, where indeed we have wholesalers, we have hoteliers who will fall into this category, where they need to be up to date with all of the other taxes here. And so, in essence, indirectly, they need a tax clearance certificate in order to be granted the license then to sell liquor, to promote their own businesses. And as one who, of course, rather see that there be equality across the board, where if it is a product that you're selling, you look for the tax that deals with that product. And so if you're selling land, you look for the land tax and ensure that land tax, of course, there are a lot of other complications there in terms of the lawyers will be able to tell us that. Why is it needed, of course, to have the land tax up to date in order to sell the land? But from my perspective here is, why is it that land tax is required for you to have a license to sell liquor? Why is it that indeed income tax is required to be up to date in order for you to sell liquor? And so, Mr. President, I see that there is a little disparity here in my interpretation of it, in my view of it, and I'm wondering, why is it that we are indeed repealing, or we're taking out the obligation of one to sell land, taking out all the other obligations that would have been stated in that big stick policy before, and only requiring the landowner, in order to sell land, to only have his land tax up to date, but he could be defaulting in income tax, he could be defaulting in excess tax, he could be defaulting in all the other taxes. But so long as he's up to date in his land tax, that gives him the right to be able to sell, get a tax clearance to sell his land. While when it comes to the liquor license situation, again, businesses that we want to promote, hoteliers, wholesalers, etc., yet there is still this within our amendments here that states that all these other taxes need to be up to date first before a license to sell liquor is allowed. And having that as a concern of mine, I even went as far as doing a little bit of research in terms of some of the neighboring islands, Jamaica and Trinidad, and also as far as looking at a little bit of United Kingdom, England. And it is interesting that while I look through their acts for liquor licensing, there is no indication of that in place, that they need to have their taxes up to date in order to sell liquor. There are, of course, other conditions in terms of course, the proximity to another wholesaler, proximity to schools, and all the other implications there as to whether or not one will be granted a license or even a renewal of a license, and of course a police certificate of character, etc. But there's, in my opinion, I didn't come across where there is a requirement that you should have a tax clearance certificate or the clearance in terms of being up to date in taxes in order to be able to receive a liquor license. And my final contribution, Mr. President, in terms of concern is how I was interpreting this bill as being promoted as one that will facilitate business. And I do hope that for example, the public sector vehicles, the PSVs, that they don't misinterpret that with this amendment that we're making today, that this will clear them from having to receive that tax clearance certificate. Because as far as I know, this only really deals with liquor licenses, deals with land tax and property transfer tax, but it doesn't deal with exempting them in the future from having to receive a tax clearance certificate in order for them to have the renewal of their permit or licenses to operate as a business here in our island. Nor does it help at this stage, and I'm saying this because I hope that we will move towards that. It doesn't at this stage, in my understanding of it, help a non-national who is working here for some time, living here and working here, to just say, well, I don't need to have my taxes updated, I don't need a tax clearance certificate in order to have a renewal of that work permit, because that is still in place within BRA, that you need a tax clearance certificate indicating, of course, that you're up to date in your taxes in order for you then to get that work permit to continue. Now again, this is not in any way suggesting that we are encouraging persons not to pay their taxes, but rather I'm just suggesting, Mr. President, that I think that we need to be clear in terms of making sure that we are not having any level of disparity here, but that we are working with others and bringing others on board and enabling others to be able to do business without the hassle necessarily of that tax clearance certificate. I do support the bill, Mr. President, but I'm just raising the questions of some areas of concern that I have, especially when it comes to the liquor license as within the Act. I am obliged to, sir.
Thank you, Senator Maxwell. I now recognize Senator Sands. Drakes first. Drakes, sorry, Drakes, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. This afternoon, I would just like to make a contribution as it relates to the amendments at hand to the Barbados Revenue Authority Act, and as it relates to the land and property transactions and liquor license transactions that we are seeking to amend. And clearly it has been seen as those business persons as an unnecessary barrier to business. The amendments somewhat are satisfactory, in my opinion, as we still would like to ensure that businesses and persons alike still pay their fair share of taxes. And the move I am hoping is a direction where we take the public sector into a more agile and flexible machine that copes with the 21st century. Mr. President, what I'd like to highlight or make note of is that we are seeking to repeal Section 8A. And I think there is some merit in Section C of that, where, and I bear with me as I read it, where it states the Revenue Authority gives the certification where where an amount is satisfactory to the commissioner that is equal to or not less than 10% of the taxes, interest and penalties which have accrued under the taxes paid, and an agreement is also made to liquidate the sums that are owed. When we look at the amendment then for the Property and Transfer Tax Act, Section B, in Section 13 that we're seeking to delete in the previous amendments in 2017, there's an addition now to the amendment that we're seeking to pass here, which I really and truly would like to highlight, which states that a certification would then be given to someone where the input tax previously allowed under Section 46 of the value-added tax has been repaid and has been repaid to the Revenue Commissioner in accordance with Section 48.4 of the Value-Added Tax Act, Cap 787, or not and, or that the Revenue Commissioner has been given for the payment thereof a security satisfactory to the Revenue Commissioner. Mr. President, what I would like to state here is that a little more clarification or general guidelines that clearly is present in what we're seeking to appeal, where you have to pay no less than 10% and an agreement is made, be inserted into possibly the Property and Transfer Act as well. Because What the addition then seeks to do is place the revenue commissioner in a very discretionary and subjective place. Mr. President, what I'd further like to say is that if we are saying we are going to become more competitive and we're removing barriers to business, there also needs to be accountability, transparency, and also traceability. Under this act, there is clearly no guidance as it relates to the payment of owed monies when the certification is being issued by the Revenue Commissioner. And that is in no way to say that persons will act in a manner that is not conducive towards the laws of Barbados, but it is to protect all parties. And to further illustrate this point, Mr. President, I also said to myself, okay, if I am a concerned citizen and I read the clause here where the Revenue Commissioner is given this type of power or this invisible hand in business, where can I find further information or financial audits as it relates to the Barbados Revenue Authority? In the modern era, we go online and we look to see what information we can gather. And what I'd like to report is that the 2016 Barbados Revenue Authority annual reports are not accessible online, first of all, for whatever technical reason or another reason for that matter. But the 2015 report is there. And Mr. President, on page 36 of that report, it says that the Auditor General is unable to confirm a number of balances due to supporting documentation. And that has always been a concern as it relates to the Auditor General's reports. So when we say or security satisfactory to the Revenue Commissioner, I think we need to place more objectivity around these types of arrangements. And the repeal of Section C of 8A does give us some guidance on how we can go about being a bit more objective in these types of matters. One suggestion I would say is that we look at the parameters around these types of arrangements and possibly even publishing these types of arrangements for the public to see, so that to ensure that persons do not believe that the law is for some and not for all. Mr. President, I acknowledge government's efforts to be more competitive and removing these types of acts, but I think that we need to start including elements, as Senator Springer notably said this morning, elements of good governance. And for me, those are elements where we include the traceability and transparency and openness of government business. And not lending them to abstract concepts, but let us seize the opportunity where we can to actually implement these measures. And I think that the devil is sometimes in the details. So with that, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Drake. I now recognize Senator Sands.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Honourable Senate. I rise to make this contribution to support wholeheartedly the measures, the amendment bill as it relates to the Barbados Revenue Authority in respect of the tax clearance certificates, the issuance of the tax clearance certificates. Now, based on the name alone, we get the feeling that it relates to tax measures, just by the name tax clearance certificate. Now, from the outset, I would like to indicate that I am not a tax guru, tax specialist, or economist. I may truly not appreciate the intricacies that are involved within the creation of taxes and tax measures. What I do understand, and what most laymen do understand, is that each tax must have a reason and a rationale for why it is created. What I do understand is that any government who is seeking to introduce a tax measure into society must have an objective or goal in which it seeks to achieve through the implementation of the tax. And it's no rocket science. Common sense would dictate that any tax measure that is being sought to be introduced into society must be clear and unambiguous. And it is within this vein, the vein of the reason for the tax measure, the objective of the tax measure, and the clarity and certainty of the tax measure in which I seek to make my presentation to you and my contribution this morning. Now, it is no secret right now in Barbados that Barbados is in a financial rut. The Democratic Labour Party government, the previous Democratic Labour Party government, based on their research, made the determination that this country had an inundated amount of persons and entities who were not contributing and paying their fair share of taxes to the country. So as a result of that, they decided that they would try to put a halt to the hemorrhaging of the tax revenue in this country. Based on their research, they came to the decision that the best way to handle this problem would be to amend the Barbados Revenue Authority Act so as to implement provisions that would require individuals or entities that seek to make dispositions of land by conveyance or by lease, or simply just wanted to renew their liquor license, that those individuals and entities would now have to obtain a tax clearance certificate in order to legitimize and facilitate business in this country. The former Minister of Finance under the Democratic Labour Party government had indicated that the tax measure, the issuance of tax clearance certificates, was in keeping with the then government's move to move away from the tax collection policy of this fragmented way of collecting taxes to a more consolidated way of collecting it under the Barbados Revenue Authority. So essentially what we would have had here then, through the implementation of the tax measures, is that all taxes, accessible taxes under the Land Tax Act, the Excise Tax Act, the Inland Revenue, Income Tax Act, and the Value Added Tax Act, all taxes under those legislations would now have to all be paid before you could even obtain, in order for you to obtain a tax clearance certificate and be able to do ordinary business in this country. Now, what I want us to be clear on here so far is that based on my presentation so far, we know that the tax measure, the reason for the tax measure was because there were a number of individuals and entities who had not paid and contributed their fair share of taxes. We know that the objective of this tax measure was to focus and target defaulters who had refused either intentionally or unintentionally to contribute their fair share of taxes. And the purpose was to bring those persons into line with their tax obligations. Now, the minister in the Ministry of Finance, as he led this debate in the other place, indicated that any government which deals with the administration of taxes must ensure that it takes into consideration the level of growth and tax certainty when it considers maximizing its collection of tax revenue. So in other words, despite the reason for which the tax measure was implemented, despite the objective for which the tax measure was implemented, the then Democratic Labour Party government should have made sure to take heed and ensure that it did not inhibit financial and business activity in this country. And it was supposed to ensure that it did not create confusion as it relates to certainty during the implementation of the tax measure. That was the job of the Democratic Labour Party government. Now, Mr. President, that clearly was not the case in this country. Because from the outset, when these amendments to the Barbados Revenue Authority had been mentioned, there was a number of organizations in Barbados, both financial and otherwise, that were up in arms about it, as there was clear confusion as to how these tax measures would have been implemented in Barbados. Now, the reality is that this tax measure might very well have been well-intended and noble, because if people are not paying the taxes, they have to ensure that they do what they can to get them to pay. But there's a difference between good intentions and bad implementation. Now, as it stands in this country, rather than this tax clearance certificate being able to stimulate or even maintain proper business activity and create certainty in regards to its implementation, it was successful in doing the complete opposite. This tax measure was single-handedly responsible for bringing to a complete halt a significant majority of property and real estate transactions in this country. The then president or representative of the Bankers of Barbados Association went to the press and indicated, she cited lack of clarity as the reason for the halt to real estate transactions in Barbados. I think she stated it was approximately 330 transactions that had to come to a complete halt because the boy just didn't understand what was going on. Now, what I want you to understand here today that 330 transactions, well, it might sound like a lot, the money is even greater. It was estimated that it was about $220 million worth of real estate transactions that could not continue in this country until the government or organizations and agencies of the government were able to provide clarity in regards to the issuance of tax clearance certificates in this country. This interruption was so major and so detrimental to the business activity in this country that the fallout exceeded the scope for the persons who had initially raised issues about it. This scope and the detrimental impact was felt beyond financial institutions and banks. Any person who was directly or indirectly involved in real estate transactions in this country felt the blowback from the confusion. So I'm talking about developers, contractors, lawyers, valuers. Any person who was a stakeholder within the real estate transaction in this country felt the detrimental impact from the stoppage of business activity. But that's not the worst situation. The worst situation here is that the same government felt the blowback as well. Because if no land transactions are happening in this country, it means that the government does not have the capacity or the ability now to reap the benefit of the tax revenue that would ideally would have been generated as a result of the completion of these real estate transactions. So $220 million worth of transactions was put on hold, and the government was unable to reap property tax, stamp duty from that same amount of money that would have been generated if there was clarity in relation to the imposition of this tax measure. Now, notwithstanding the confusion, real estate transactions was able to resume business at some point in time. However, it was no longer business as usual. It was no longer business as usual. We were accustomed to completing transactions without the need for a tax clearance certificate. Now that was a requirement to complete the transaction. So initially we had delays. There was confusion at the Barbados Revenue Authority, there was confusion amongst the lawyers, there was confusion in the banks, because we still wasn't sure, but we trotted on. There came a time now when they started to have a delay. Some persons, grateful for them, they were able to obtain their tax clearance certificates within a reasonable time. But there was a significant amount of persons who complained that they had delays of up to a month and over a month waiting for the issuance of the tax clearance certificate. So they got every other document that is needed to complete this matter. The only outstanding piece of document is the tax clearance certificate, and we have to wait on it, or until somebody figure out when to issue it. That is bad. That's simply not good enough. We cannot be serious about doing business. A delay of a month. I just heard one of my colleagues here indicate that, I cannot remember the place that she stated, but persons were getting their tax clearance certificates instantaneously, within a day, within a week maybe. But we here waiting over a month for land transactions to be completed. A delay of over a month to obtain a tax clearance certificate is undisputably a negative impact on the ease to doing business in this country. And it has the consequence of deterring both local and international investors from even considering to do business in this country. If we are serious about the transformation of Barbados and about creating a more business-friendly and efficient environment for people to do business here, we cannot be implementing tax measures which will seek to inhibit and become a hindrance to business activity in this country, especially in a time when we need it the most. Mr. President, earlier I explained that the objective of this tax clearance certificate was to focus and target the defaulters, basically the people who were not paying their taxes. Now, my understanding of that is that if you don't pay, the tax measure is specifically to deal with you, the defaulter. Excuse me. Well, it goes without saying that the alternative is also correct. That if you are in compliance with your taxes, that the tax clearance certificate ain't got nothing to do with you. You compliant, that's for the people that is defaulters. Now, if, through you, Mr. President, the honorable senators here share the same view as I do, let me be the first to tell you that we were all horribly wrong. If you were defaulted or not, the tax clearance certificate had an impact on you. And I will give you an explanation through one of my experiences. Now, as it stands, any land transaction in Barbados passing from one owner to the next requires both a buyer and a seller. Now, if you're a vendor, based on the policy of the tax measure, you have to obtain a tax clearance certificate. Now, the purchaser, on the other hand, if they were using a mortgage to facilitate the purchase of the land, that person would also need to acquire a tax clearance certificate. Now, I have a client, he's an elderly person. He wanted to sell his land to another gentleman. My client, the gentleman, the purchaser of my client's land, the potential purchaser of my client's land, he had already been approved for financing from a financial institution. So the agreements were made, everybody was on the same page. My client was able to obtain his tax clearance certificate as he's the vendor. The problem then occurred when the purchaser could not obtain a tax clearance certificate in order to get his mortgage. So what we had here was one person, two people to do a transaction. One person, an innocent tax-paying person, and on the other, a defaulter. And because of the defaulter, the old man could not sell his property. And to this day, his property remains unsold. Now, I am of the view that if that old man truly needed the money to help with any medical bills, the then Democratic Labour Party government would have signed his death warrant. Because despite he is in compliance with taxes, he is still a victim under this tax measure. He is still disadvantaged even when he has sought to do right by his tax obligations. Now, I refuse to believe that it was ever the intention of the Democratic Labour Party government to create a tax measure that would seek to disadvantage innocent citizens who are tax compliant with their tax obligations. But notwithstanding their intent, it definitely had that impact. It had that effect. Now, I personally do not believe that they foresaw the consequences that would have, and consequences and potential spill-off into society that would have occurred as a result of this tax measure. I believe that what they were so focused on was just capitalizing and maximizing on tax collection, the collection of tax revenue, that they disregarded any potential casualty or any eventuality that could have occurred in respect of this umbrella tax. That is my personal view as it relates to this government, that they looked at this tax through a myopic lens and decided that, forget everything else, I'm just interested in collecting money. That is the way and the method of the Democratic Labour Party government. Now, to you, Mr. President, let me state outright that neither myself, and I believe I can speak for all of the honourable senators on the government side as well as on the independent side, and even the opposition, that no one here today is in support of the notion that persons should try to evade the payment of their taxes. The government needs tax revenue to ensure that we obtain the social benefits that the government seeks to provide to the citizens of Barbados. But I equally understand, so I truly understand that there must be a way in which the government is supposed to net and grab these persons who seem to be defaulting and getting away with it for over 20 plus years. As I read in some article, persons have not been paying the land tax for over 20 years. Now, I equally understand, however, that for more than 10 years, there has been provisions within legislation that already exists on our books, which enable the Crown, which gives the Crown the power to pursue the same people that the tax measure was seeking to net, seeking to grab. And to use the already established legislation meant that it would be no need for the amendment to the law. It would be before the creation of confusion. There would be no disruption to business, and there would be no need for the disadvantaging of people who are already tax compliant if we had already used the laws that already exist on the statute books. As it currently stands, the Crown has the authority under the Land Tax Act, Value Added Tax Act, Income Tax Act, to pursue any person or entity who has failed to pay their taxes. And the process is quite simple. All that's required, once you identify that this person has not paid their taxes, the commissioner, the revenue commissioner, simply issues a unpaid tax certificate. He files it in the court. After a stipulated period of time, if that person does not challenge it or pays the money, it is recorded as a debt. And from there, the Crown has all right to pursue the debt in court. That is all it took. Identify who the defaulter is, put the unpaid certificate in place, file it. Once it becomes a debt, pursue that person. And the legislation did not just stop there, that you can record it and that's the end of it. The legislation gave the Crown the further power that it could even intervene in transactions between a defaulter and a person who intended to pay him, or if he was an employee, he could intervene and garnish the wages of the employer. So there are numerous ways in which the government of the time could have pursued defaulters. Either through garnishing the wages, making the employer pay them a portion of their salary so that it goes to the reduction and liquidation of their debt, or sending a demand letter to whoever third party out there owes money to the defaulter to ensure that rather than that money goes to the defaulter, it is directed directly to the Crown and to liquidate the debt. There were a number of things that the then Democratic Labour Party government could have done to deal with the issue as it relates to tax evaders and tax defaulters. But the best one from the Land Tax is from the Land Tax Act. The Land Tax Act has the latitude. We ain't talking about going to the employer, we ain't talking about taxing, we're not talking about intervening in between people. The Land Tax Act gives the Crown the authority that if you fail to pay your land tax and it has been in arrears for an inordinate period of time, we can take out your land and sell it. That is the method of the legislation. It is within the powers of the Crown. So to then come and implement this tax measure when we already have different things in place that enables the Crown to be able to pursue and get its money from defaulters, it is above me. That is why, Mr. President, I am of the view that it is clear in my mind that the system of tax clearance certificates was simply unnecessary, especially in circumstances when the Democratic Labour Party government had a numerous set of powers available to it to be used to enable it to pursue defaulters. The tax measures may have been well-intended, probably even noble, but the implementation clearly caused more mischief than it cured. And that is why I support this bill to amend the Barbados Revenue Authority Act so as to repeal the system of tax clearance certificates on all related matters. I'm obliged.
Senator Boyce.
Through you, sir. I listened, very impressed with the enthusiasm of Senator Sands. The confidence to have such a clear vision should be commended, and I commend him for it. I remember when I was at that age, not too far, but it's far enough, when things seemed that clear. Now, having experienced one or two things in life, you suddenly realize that what once seemed extremely elusive becomes a bit less so. And I've listened today with admiration with the different perspectives being brought to bear to the table. But I realized there was always a focus on the past. And that actually prompted me to rise, because I want to make a small contribution to the future as to what we do going forward and what this legislation that we're debating could be utilized for, and what lessons we can learn from the legislation that we're seeking to repeal. Firstly, the concept of a tax clearance. The noble concept, Senator Sands says, is actively utilized in Canada, Australia, and Ireland successfully. But of course, the proof of the proverbial pudding being in the eating, implementation is required for it to be effective. And I believe the lesson that is coming out of the debate is that while the idea was a good one, it needed to be implemented in a manner or with a resource base to Please continue, sir. Thank you, Mr. President. It needed to be implemented in a manner and or with a resource base to allow the noble intention to be fulfilled. I believe it's to err is human and forgive is to be divine. And you can see the appeal of it. You're going to do a transaction, you stand to benefit from it financially, well then you should fulfill your obligation to the state. My fellow independent senator would tell you no less authority than Matthew 22:21. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. But the impact that was felt, and my firm did feel it, and we saw it firsthand, was significant. So we have an idea that was good, however, the implementation caused the concern. What I would suggest to this honorable chamber is that perhaps we can look and see what could have been done differently. And there may be ideas or data we can extract from the period when it was in place that would be of benefit to Barbados going forward. I am aware that while there was an initial reduction in transactions, after a series of consultations with the relevant parties, and perhaps those consultations should have been done before, the process was worked out and transactions moved forward. Unfortunately, however, the damage was already done. And maybe the lesson to be learned is that there's a certain risk when things are done in a hasty manner. This is a point which was made to this House when we were debating another amendment recently, and I would like to repeat it. Let us take our time and do what is right in a quick manner, but learn from the experiences of the past as we chart our way forward. So perhaps investigations could be done by the government today with the BRA as to what occurred during the period in which the legislation was in place.
how many defaulting parties got their house in order to allow a transaction? How many persons were actually compelled to do the right thing? And perhaps we may find a way to look at the utilization. In other words, perhaps there may be elements that we can take from it to be used going forward. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and let's learn what we can from the experience. We have clearly been extremely vocal in how it affected persons. So as we look forward to the wonderful future that we all yearn for, let's see what we can learn from the past to make it better. That's my contribution, sir.
Right, I recognize Senator Goodrich.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to make a short contribution to this amendment to the Barbados Revenue Authority Act. Now, there was a bit of controversy surrounding this particular section of the Act from its very inception. The main irritant in the legislation was the demand by the Barbados Revenue Authority that before obtaining a land tax certificate, you had to first obtain a full tax clearance on everything. That is where the main irritant was. In other words, you had to provide them with evidence that you had paid your land tax on, let's say you had 2 pieces of land. You had to show them that you had paid your land tax on both properties. So if I live in St. Philip and I have another property in St. Andrew, and someone was buying the St. Andrew property from me, if the St. Andrew property was up to date with taxes, I had to show that the one I live in St. Philip, that the taxes on that were paid as well. Otherwise, that transfer there in St. Andrew could not have occurred. I also had to show that it was up to date on my income tax, on VAT, on my NIS. In other words, the whole works. That is where the irritant in this legislation was. And it applied primarily to the person who was selling the land. But it prevented, as Senator Sands pointed out, it prevented the purchaser very often from getting on with the purchase, and it frustrated the banks and the credit unions who were willing to lend the purchaser the money. Some of you had a situation where the purchasers, workmen, the masons, the carpenters, and so on, had to wait and wait until the vendor had got that all-embracing tax clearance. And sometimes when you looked around, that particular mason that you really wanted was nowhere because he went and had a job with some firm somewhere else. And I know that because it happened to a client of mine. And the question which was asked by many was, why should the vendor, not paying his other taxes, keep the purchaser back to this extent? And similarly, if my grandmother had left me a piece of land in her will, then I had to get full land tax clearance for my grandmother for everything before the land could be put in my name. Now, my position is that the taxes on that particular piece of land which I'm selling, once they are up to date, that the transfer should take place. And then you should find a way to deal with the other unrelated taxes which are outstanding. Find a way to deal with them, whether through the specific income tax legislation, through the VAT legislation, whatever. But once the tax on that particular one being sold is up to date, get on with it. And that is my position. And I do not think, as Senator Maxwell has said, that this would in any way encourage defaulters. I don't think so at all. I think that once you know you have to pay your VAT, you know you have to do that under that act and take the punishment, the penalties, whatever, under that act. But don't tell me that every single thing has to be up to date before I could make that transfer. We have heard about 4 or 5 times in this chamber this morning, Mr. President, that in life no one likes to pay taxes. But every Barbadian knows that we must grease the wheel of government. We have to, in order so that we can have the social services that we've come so accustomed to. But we expect, Mr. President, some logical reasoning, some rational explanation for the imposition of measures like these. As I repeat again, don't tell me that I have to pay every single piece of taxes to which I'm entitled as a prerequisite for my ownership of the property that I'm selling. And I'm sure too, Mr. President, that if there was proper consultation by the last administration, proper consultation with the Bar Association in particular, that this legislation would never have been, this particular section in the legislation would never have been on the books in the first place. Lawyers, Mr. President, were very annoyed at this particular piece of legislation. And it crippled and it paralyzed a lot of lawyers' ability to effect final transfers on properties that they were dealing with. And to earn a living, as I'm being told. It was a real obstacle in their way. And lawyers would tell you so. The former Minister of Finance, he became the public face and the public voice of this unfortunate piece of legislation. But the former Prime Minister, he is an attorney at law. And I believe that he should have seen this through the eyes, through the lens of a lawyer. And that he should have anticipated a lot of the negative impact that the lawyers were complaining about. I recall, Mr. President, that the Bar Association was so annoyed that they threatened to take the matter to the court so that the court could make a ruling on it. Lawyers are directly involved in land matters, very deeply involved, and they are so engaged for their livelihood. A lot of people may not know, but there are some lawyers in Barbados who do nothing else but land matters. And when you hold up land matters from those lawyers, you are taking away their livelihood. Some people honestly do not touch anything else besides land. And the last administration should never have ignored the loud pleas and protests which came from the lawyers. But in fact, where the last administration was concerned, willingness to listen was always in short supply. always in short supply.
Same thing as deafness.
Deafness. Mr. President, I had a client, 80 years plus. He lived in England. And he came down when he was selling a property. His matter was at the tail end. We had reached the tail end of his matter. And I told him, yes, you can get ready and come. And he was coming down to put some money on the bank here and to take back some to England. You know, and he came down with his daughter. And the daughter complained every day for the month that she was in Barbados, because he had to be running around trying to get a land tax certificate and doing all these things. And you know, they had to leave and go back to England without the matter coming to a conclusion because they didn't get the tax certificate in time. They had to leave and go back. You know, we have already been accused throughout the Caribbean. They tell us that we are the slowest business facilitators in the Caribbean. And we've been told that there's too much red tape in our processing. I don't mind the color red at all, but I don't mind the color red. I don't mind that at all. But there is too much red tape in our processing. We have been accused, Mr. President, that we have too much paper. We have too many forms to fill out. Throughout the Caribbean, you can hear it. And how does it help us, Mr. President, to insist that we provide evidence that the VAT is paid and the income tax is paid? That is only adding another layer of delay to an already slow process. And the sooner we realize matters like this, the better it will be for the country. And therefore, I'm happy, Mr. President, this afternoon to see that we are doing something to effect the removal of this stumbling block. I am happy to see that this morning, earlier, removed another stumbling block. And I know a few weeks ago, all clothed in red, removed yet another stumbling block. And so, I don't know if this is unparliamentary. And I want to know how the country feels as a relief. And I can only say that having removed the last administration, it feels as though, it might be unparliamentary, but I don't know. But it feels as though this country has had a bowel movement. I'm obliged to you, Mr. President. If it has to be withdrawn, I unhesitatingly withdraw it, Mr. President.
I don't think I heard it.
Mr. President, I know you didn't hear it. Mr. President, I rise to close the debate on this bill. I want to thank all honorable members, both sides, for their contributions. Some very enlightening ones from Senator Cummins and Senator, he's not in his chair now, Senator Sands, but also Senator Maxwell. I've taken note of your concerns, the interest in terms of the requirements for liquor licenses. I noted that. And certainly Senator Boyce, again, seemingly more enlightened. Your talk about tax certificates not necessarily being a bad thing, but we should look at the implementation. I've taken notes in terms of your comments, all of you, and all I can say is that I'm glad that we're all supporting this bill this evening. I think it's very important in terms of business facilitation within Barbados, and we continue to keep working together. It seems like this is a new spirit within this honorable chamber. But there was few words I want to beg to move that this bill be now read a second time.
We move that this bill be now read a second time. All those in favor, please say aye. All those against? I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I do now beg that Your Honor do now leave the chair, and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
It has been moved that I do now absent myself while the Senate resolve itself into committee for the further consideration of this matter. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against? I think the ayes have it.
The House is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 1 stand part.
The question is that clause 1 stand part. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 2 stand part.
The question is that clause 2 stand part. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 3 stand part.
The question is that clause 3 stand part. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 4 stand part.
The question is that clause 4 stand part. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Schedule.
So, Chairman, I beg to move that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Passing of the chairman has reported the passage of the bill under consideration in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
It's been moved that the bill under consideration be now read a third time.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the bill be now passed and be cited as the Barbados Revenue Authority Amendment Bill Act 2018.
It has been read. It has been moved that the bill under consideration be now passed and be so cited. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? None opposed.
Mr. President, I beg to move that we now revert to minutes.
It has been moved that this chamber now revert to consideration of the minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday the 3rd and Friday the 8th of June 2018. Those in favor? None opposing?
Revert to public business.
Say hard. Say hard.
He didn't hear what you said. Mr. President, this brings us to the end of business for today, and I beg to move that the Senate be now adjourned, sine die.
It is been moved that this chamber be now adjourned without a day appointed. Sign the day. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? I think the ayes have it. We now stand adjourned. Thank you. You need to get off.